So, thank you, Anna. I'm always amazed at these things, how you manage to construct a theme. And last year we had all about inflammation, and this year all about metabolomics. And when you sort of like get into that track of looking at things, how all of a sudden all of the talks seem to overlap, and you have so much interaction. It's a great way of interchange of information, and I'd thoroughly encourage, if you ever get asked to talk at one of these things, it's great to step forward and do it. A bit nerve-wracking, but great to step forward and do it. I've had a bit of practice because of these two guys, and I think I'll probably have to do this bit first, if it'll show. Ooh, won't go backwards. So you're supposed to do this at the beginning of the talk. Okay, so this is full disclosure, so you quickly know who I am, what it's about. Yes, I do have goats, and I do like to live out in the field when I can, rather than being under a roof, but that's just one of the parts. Yes, I'm part of this threesome. It is you can see from some of the pictures, we've enjoyed ourselves here in the past, in the background. Raw Pet Medics is every Tuesday. It's a great way of really pushing my brain to think more about the topics. But my primary purpose as a vet, first and foremost, is that I've been part of Towerwood for over 25 years now, so vet for 30 years. Towerwood is very much a holistic practice, and I've been a partner and owner for that 25 years. I've been president of the RFVS. That encompassed me creating a certification mark called RawSafe. I do a little bit of work, consultancy work for Bella and Duke, just so that people know that I'm also working for a raw food company. I am currently the president of the British Association of Homeopathic Veterinary Surgeons. Yes, I do have a holistic and homeopathic slant to a lot of what I do as well. And as Anna quite rightly said, I'm also part of the Health Sensei, which is all about small changes that you can make in both human and animal health to get the biggest gains in longevity. And that's with Rowan, as Anna also said. This is Rowan beside me. Everybody's slightly smaller. It's always really frustrating. You have to go like this. Anyway, so he'll just say he's further away, but that's another joke. So from a point of view of saying what I'm saying today, Rowan has a massive influence on my conversations, because he brings a lot of functional medicine from the human sphere into what I can then do in the animal world. And very much I'm there to try and interpret what he's doing and seeing if it's relevant. And hopefully that will come across today in what we're going to talk about, which was a very verbose title in the proceedings, and that's probably my fault, because I quickly had to spit something out to Anna when she was pressing me. And I thought, well, and things evolve. You hear things as we come to these conferences, and I'm sort of pretending that it was just my laxity, but I'm probably actually following what Anna does, writing notes vigorously into my talk as we go. But I also want to make sure that you guys really review the shortened title, which is A Functional Approach to the Use and Abuse of Supplements, which actually is something that even I have fallen into. And it's a realization that actually, there's a progression slowly of thought. And with this, epigenetic influence that we talked about, and we were talking about inflammation all of last year, it really took me to think a little bit harder about why that should be a little bit easier to see slight changes. What happens at the genetic level that makes epigenetics so important? And why isn't it just all of the time? And why isn't just giving us a pill for all ill going to work every single time? And Connor, he'll recognize himself because he likes that. And he's not a showman at all. He did put a question mark after this, and I was going to misquote him terribly today, but now he's in the audience, I'm going to say, no, he put a question mark there, because he does feel that it's not a pill for all ill. And no, I haven't put that other photo in this talk to embarrass you further about your... Maybe at the end, if I've got time. So certainly, there are so many influences. We all like to hark on about, going back to nature and feeding naturally and communing in our wide open fields. But let's face it, most of the population are here. They are sat in a big city somewhere with dogs on the street, with very little greenery and loads of chemicals not intentionally being given. Yeah, we can all stop the flea and worm treatments. We can all stop vaccinating. We can even, stop giving them plastic bowls to eat out of. However, just by walking down this street, this poor dog is being exposed to lots of particulates, which will have an impact on his genetic expression. So it also gets to me when I'm listening to the experience of many practitioners out there who are discussing not just their successes, but really the reasoning for their failures. And, I took something that was said the other day, that actually, every failure is a true learning opportunity and should never be seen as a downside. And literally look at these rules that are based on people's experience, but actually some of them would seem to be counterintuitive. And what I mean by that is you think, I love fermented foods. Why does somebody say that that's really bad for animals? Okay? Or I, love to use Epitor, which is a mix of vitamin Bs and taurine, tyrosine for seizure patients. But some patients will act really adversely when you give those supplements. So there's things like, people talking about histamines. I love bone broth. The guys know I love bone broth. I'll talk about it as much as I can. But as soon as we see things like that and fermented foods, people were worrying that they're going to cause a gut reaction. I mean, bless poor Connor. He looks at that and he comes out in a cold sweat because he can't tolerate, brassicas of any description. I'm sure one of these nights we're going to get you to drink a broccoli smoothie without you knowing. But it just is that they have these adverse reactions. And then they will eulogize that across all of their patients because their personal experience says that. And hopefully I'm going to identify today why you might be able to spot the differences and what patients this will work for and what patients you need to avoid this in. So the other bits, it's just a detox reaction. That really winds me up, okay? An excuse of, I've given something that I think is a really great supplement. The dog has exploded with diarrhea. Oh, it's just a detox reaction. That poor dog is suffering from horrendous diarrhea, sometimes vomiting, sometimes horrendous skin reactions. I think we've got to be tempering what we're looking at there as to, is that what we should be putting dogs through? So really important to think about quality of life, to think about ethics, and is it truly a detox reaction? Supplements that just stop working. They've been brilliant, seem to be fine, and all of a sudden, the patient goes off a cliff of horrendous symptoms again, and you think, well, do I just double the dose? And it keeps getting worse, and it's just not working. So, what can we do about that? CBD, loads of people love to talk about their experience with CBD, and we make excuses like, well, you're not using a pharmaceutically graded CBD, and that's why it's not working. Or, you've got variants between different options. But actually, there are just some cases it will not work for because they are not genetically primed with their epigenetics to respond. Okay, so don't get stuck in that rut of works for me, I'm going to use it, or this particular brand works for me, it must be right. Or there's that other extreme, and Connor read a book I recommended to him by Neil Nathan called Toxic, and he goes through this where they react to everything. The slightest change in diet, the slightest remedy, even homeopathy, and as many of you in the room might think, well, that's virtually nothing anyway, and yet a single dose of a single remedy, and they can have massive adverse reactions. Okay, and sometimes it's not because of homeopathic aggravation, again, that we tend to excuse it for, but actually it's because, or maybe it is because, we get aggravations because they've got issues with what we're going to talk about. So hopefully that sets the scene for why I'm going to talk about this today. You know, out of the 20,000 or so genes, there's about 6 billion letter codes within that genome for the dog. And what we're going to talk about is, within that, there's about 172,000 SNPs, and I'm going to sit you down and take you through every single one, piece by piece. Have we got a year till? No, I'm not going to do that. And, you know, you look at that and you think, and I've, you know, thankfully got some permissions to share some of this information for educational purposes. And you think, okay, well, does my genome really determine my health? And as Robin said the other day, you know, yesterday, literally that collision of environment and your genome can massively make a difference to the expression of the genome, the phenotype that you get. And I apologize for any geneticists that are looking at this and thinking, oh my God, do we need to go back that far? But do you know what? Sometimes it is good to reflect on what's going on. And expression comes around through various things of how your genome is then transcribed into the proteins within your cell. And there are a couple of options here. So methylation will, at some points, actually, if it's in the primer area of the gene, close that down and stop the, so if you've got hypermethylation of a primer, then effectively the gene won't be transcribed. And if you've got a hypomethylation of the primer, but a hypermethylation of the actual genome, then it will be supertranscribed. So there's a good way of mixing that up. There's all sorts of then influences, as you see the little red dots coming in to interfere with that whole process. So it gets really, really complicated. And you just think, oh my God, wow, I'm in overwhelm. I can't really think about all of this information as to how do we possibly survive. You know, how do we actually function as a creature to be able to get ourselves across the line? So it can become quite overwhelming. And then Rowan was talking to me about a book that was published last year. He's been working for quite a while by Ben Lynch. And he was talking about actually just honing down to 7 specific genes to look at. Okay, that's 7 specific enzymes that are affected that can make a massive difference to your metabolism. And some of you who've listened to Rowan before, again, you'll probably now be switching off and thinking, oh, I'll just have a little snooze. I was out late last night. So there you go. You've got to relax on the back row. But really, for those that haven't, I think it's really worth going through these 7 genes. Hold your cameras down for a moment. It will come up at the end. I'll leave a moment for all 7. Otherwise, you're taking 7 pictures. So, you know, this is a real tongue twister to be setting yourself up for when you're sat on the front of a stage and trying to get through the methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase, you know, which actually we jokingly referred to as the mother of, no, I'm not going to say it, of all genes, methylation. That's the primary. It's a really good one to concentrate on if you don't do any others. But there are some really great ones to look at, and I'm going to talk later about how they're relevant to some of the tests you may have heard of already and what you're doing. But We'll look at the catechol-O-methyltransferase and its effects on estrogens, the diamine oxidase, which some people that just can't tolerate any histamine-rich foods will particularly have a problem with, especially if they involve fermentation of yeasts and things like that. And he's desperately looking away so that nobody concentrates on him. And then you've got the monoamine oxidase A. Now, this is a really important one when we're talking about your response to dopamine conversion into serotonin, and I will go through these in a bit more detail shortly. So glutathione S-transferase and the glutathione peroxidase. So these are the main detox enzymes that you deal with. You've got nitric oxide synthase 3. Okay, this again is all about vasculature and how well you can maintain blood pressure and what's going on with your ability. We'll talk about how that can be influenced for not just us but for our dogs. And phosphatidyl ethanolamine methyltransferase, again, PEMT. Okay, these are the 7. So now you can take the picture. I promise I won't skip off it until you've put your camera down. So briefly, there is the book if you want to read in more detail about this. All of these do have various research items on them. But just to try and take you through that in the short time that we have today, without taking the 14 hours that the Audible book would put you through, is literally, you can read, this is mainly about methylation, which has a master for what's happening with your stress response, inflammation, brain chemistry. As you can pretty much see, it affects many, many tissues. And it's really important when you're doing tests that you think about which tissue you're testing, because otherwise we'd just be an amorphous blob rather than actually a functional being, because you have to transcribe the right proteins in the right place at the right time to have specific tissues. So think about what level of methylation is going on, whether you're methylating in the right place at the right time. So these are bits to say, is it relevant to our dogs? And, we can actually see some behavioral changes if you take samples from appropriate tissues. Even looking at sometimes cheek swabs, they're still getting the same relevance to what's happening with our dogs and how able they are to adapt to our environment. And that's partly why they become our best friend. There is this element of what is dirty. So let me just explain. With these SNPs, these SNPs, these single nucleotide changes, which on an earlier slide you've seen, is literally a transcription of 2 letters difference within the whole gene, would be classed as one SNP. And these SNPs effectively will be considered dirty, and you can either be born dirty, okay, calm down, Connor. He raises his eyebrows. I know he was raising his eyebrows before I even looked at him. And from a point of view of this is that you have inherited this SNP. But actually, you can become dirty, which is really what he does. And from a point of view of that is when your environment is affecting that SNP and actually can change how it's presenting. Okay. So what are the strengths? Because there are always pros and cons, okay, to these SNPs. And everybody thinks that genetic mutation may be, something that's deleterious to health. But sometimes, genetics doesn't work like that. There are always going to be benefits for you. And there are therefore things that it might make you really intense, alert, productive, focused, and able to avoid certain diseases. But it also may mean that you have these other excesses, depending on what you're eating and influenced by. So again, going through all of these, I'm not going to bore you. It's on the slide. You can take a picture if you want. But interestingly, when it comes to things like heart attack, we wouldn't necessarily concern ourselves for dogs too much with regards to that. But we may be considering what's going on with thrombosis, especially in cats. How relevant is it for those saddle thrombosis that can occur? Autism, I will declare now that actually I do believe that we see dogs with autistic traits. Definitively going through that. I know some people would say they don't see it, but actually when you treat them in an autistic way and actually treat them in a way that you would unwind some of the autistic problems for people, you can actually unravel those. So I would declare that there is autism in some of our behavioral cases. So this is one that I find really interesting, and I would just say, look, hormones, I concentrated on hormones and how we metabolize them and why we metabolize them in a certain way. And this was mentioned by Robin the other day when he was looking at mammary cancer. And actually there is a lot discussed about when you've got BRCA genes, or you've got to take all of the breast material away because otherwise you're going to be predisposed to having these tumors. But actually you can make a massive influence on whether you're going to succumb to mammary tumors by how your hormones are metabolized. And actually, wouldn't it be great that instead of doing mastectomies, that you could just change your diet? Okay. So there are certainly this is the one that Ben Lynch concentrated on, and it was really interesting to hear about the influence that has, because back for this particular reference was how COMT actually had an influence upon the mammary carcinomas in dogs and their relative survival rates. So it's certainly out there, and it's great to see all of those things. I think metabolomics has a great place to play to see not just genetically what's going on, but actually what that transcription is like. And we'll talk about some tests coming up. I'm going to speed through these. Everybody knows what histamine does, okay? And if you're not transcribing something that effectively deactivates that, how excess histamine can cause a problem. Again, we know it happens in dogs. This guy even referenced you, Anna, so it can't be that bad, about your atopic study. And again, just going through what happens, why can it be great to have it, and why it can be sometimes a bit of a weakness. And this is probably the biggest one that people get worried about if they're feeding histamine foods to, and so that they will be panicking at the slightest, transgression into some fermented foods. Does it mean that you're always dirty when you're born dirty? No. There are things that you can do to actually change that prospect. So don't get tied up with genetics is your destiny. Okay? You can change the expression regardless of what it says on the map. Okay? Take another route. So this is the one that some of us find really interesting when it comes to concentration, whether we're fully alert, what's happening with our moods. There are relevances to aggression in dogs. There are ways through ultimately to think about the strengths. You can be more self-confident. You can have true highs of productivity and focus. But then you can also have mood swings, carb cravings. Can't think who this reminds me of sometimes. And irritability, headaches, insomnia, just can't get to sleep. His mind is whirring. There's certain addictions, maybe to tobacco, those sort of things that just are really hard to shake. So then we have things like detox. It can be great if you're able to detox, but it can have impacts on what happens with toxicity of certain chemotherapeutic drugs. But actually, if you have a problem with being able to remove some of those chemotherapeutic drugs. It can mean that they're more effective when you come to treat their cancer. Does that mean it's great? Well, actually, not so much, because although you might respond well to treatment, you're actually almost predisposed to increased DNA damage, which probably means you're more at risk of cancer in the first place. This is one that you would look at and think, is it relevant? You know, we think about heart attacks with people and, you know, what the major influence is for our dogs. You know, but actually, how many of us have seen transient ischemic attacks? What's going on as far as the issues with these stroke-like symptoms? Is it because of the effects of what's going on with NOS3? Strokes, again, I would say are relatively rare, but often are reported within our dogs. Cognitive dysfunction, where there's vascular anomalies, again, this can have an effect. So have a little look at these. There's less talked about, certainly in the canine world, about the last of these two, but certainly they are mammalian genes. They are mammalian influences across the board, so it's worth taking note of. And actually, I put up a product there which is where you've got the dog version of NOS that can be detected, so that you're looking out to see whether that's a problem for your dog. Decreased blood vessel formation, angiogenesis, so during cancer, so it can effectively decrease that. That can also then have an impact that some of the weaknesses that you may not heal quite so well, that you may be more vulnerable to some of the impacts of having high blood pressure, headaches, etc. PEMT, very lastly, go through this, and then we'll move on to a few benefits that we can see for ourselves. So this is really about sort of what's going on in your liver, what should be happening as far as muscle health, brain development, so you can immediately transpose all of those. This is really how the pathway works, and all of those diseases that are isolated out in blue, that it can have a, but you know, let's face it, the choline is required everywhere, and it's really talking about trying to make sure that your cell membranes work appropriately. So again, just going through methylation, better response to chemotherapy, there's weaknesses with what happens with your liver, all of that side of things. I'm not going to go through those in detail here. I think from a point of view of what does it mean for your dog, your puppy, you know, how do you look at what's going on here? You know, what are they going to be exposed to? Is great methylation the right thing to be doing? And some people would say, do I need to test my puppy at that age to work out what they're going to experience in the future, and then start going through a whole pile of supplements that I'm going to be sticking into the diet? I just thought I'd put up an AI picture just to please you, Anna, that AI was still alive and well. But to point out that really, you know, you can do the genetics tests, but actually there are quite a lot of great tests out there to look at your metabolomics for us. But please don't think that I'm just going to surreptitiously let my dog wee on a stick and then send it off and put it through the Dutch test, and then I'm just going to sort of try and interpret what's going on from there. Because the guys at Dutch will get really upset with you because they actually are collating all of that information. And it's really hard to explain why there's an outlier group of, you know, Fido and Dudley and, you know, various other dogs that suddenly come into their whole database. So you do have to declare to them if you're sending a dog. And they'll probably say, please don't send it to us. But it's great to hear, although it's serum, that's being looked at, and we heard about that yesterday, that's being looked at in the same sort of way. I hope that they start to deal more with the urine testing that you were looking at, because I think that's going to be much more accessible to everybody rather than just a vet drawing blood. So the Dutch test does look at methylation. It looks at hormone pathways. Some of you in the room may have already had this done by precision analytical on your own urine to try and make some changes within what you do. And I would just say, look, do have a look at what you would do to change, and whether you're experiencing the change that you expect. Because if you're not, actually, you may be doing it slightly wrong, and there's other things that need to be taken into account. And it's not as simple as just throw more in, it will be better. Just keep throwing more in, it will be better. It doesn't work like that. So do look at your symptoms. And that's the other thing. So it doesn't have to be an expensive test. If you want to know about questionnaires, there's a pre-formed questionnaire that comes with the script, just so that you're able to sort of work out which of those genes are maybe affected and then how to deal with those. You may say every vet should take a good history. How many times do we get in there and we've got 10 to 15 minutes and they've got this symptom that's screaming at us, and actually the only thing that you do is you reach for the first medicine that you can think about, and I'm sure there are other people who are in the nutrition world, the first supplement that they can think about to suddenly launch at that dog, because they just really don't have time to go through looking at the history and what might be going on in that history. But also think about taking the history of the carer, because epigenetics will not just affect the dog. They will be affecting, probably very similarly, the person that's looking after that dog. Now, I used to talk about, thinking about the autonomic nervous system and how you interact through polyvagal theory with the pets around you, how they pick up from your disease. It was mentioned yesterday about how owners can suffer from similar diseases to their pets. I see a lot of nods in the room, so a lot of people are talking about that. But actually, it's probably because they're also exposed to the same epigenetic factors that are going on, the same environmental stressors that are going on. So you walk your dog 2 hours a day, you wonder why you act the same way as your dog. Probably because there's very much similar things going on with your gene expression. Some people claim not to be anywhere near the same as their dog, and I think they just need to take a long, hard look at themselves or wonder whether they truly are the carer. So how do we achieve the not too much, not too little? Because actually there is a Goldilocks zone for many of these supplements. And you've got to think that it's really hard to give you a dosage. So I've purposely not gone, here's a supplement, this is the dosage, this is what you need to use. Because actually I'm going to give you some guidance on whatever supplement is put in front of you. Think about how it should be used and how you should approach. So today is more about, look, think about what age are they? This was mentioned yesterday. Disease-related. So have they got a disease? Have they got something else going on underlying? Have they got concomitant diseases, so number of diseases at the same time that are influencing them? Even the time of year can be a factor, okay, for the genetic expression. The time of day can be a factor, which is why you don't need to supplement every single day, and why you might need to choose a supplement at a certain time of day. The sex of the animal in front of you, or whether they've been desexed, can make a massive difference. And then remember, even then, you've got all of those factors, and then you've grouped all of those thousands of animals together, and then actually, no, they're all individuals. So this is why a dosage is only a guide. It is not hard and fast, and you should always go through this process. So supplement to effect. So give yourself a guide, start the process, see what the response is. You might need to go through a point of, does it react? If it does react, if it has an adverse reaction, stop, wait, start lower. Sounds very homeopathic, but actually this actually applies to your supplements as well, what you're doing with feeding, exposure to environments that you're putting them in, all of those facts. And then once the desired effect is seen, do not just keep carrying on. Do not just keep pumping more in thinking, oh, well, that worked, I'm on a winner now, because all you're really doing is not affecting a health change for that individual. All you're doing is what you're eulogizing that you shouldn't do, which is suppressing a symptom. You are just thinking, do you know what? It's working, I'm getting away with it, keep on going, keep buying my product, and that's great, and I'll sit back and I'll just enjoy the proceeds. No, what you should be advising is, okay, we've got you over the hill, we've saved the quality of life. What we want to do now is actually move you towards health. So with guidance and symptom check, so again, if you're not a vet, do refer them just to keep some health check-ins going on. Don't leave them alone on their own. Do think about pulse dosing. The body has a really great way of adapting what it does to being able to take more when it needs it, and not necessarily, if you flood it all the time with excess, then it sometimes just doesn't have the ability to come out of that. And there are some great stories about those ADHD children that are taking excessive amounts of serotonin and how irritable they then become, and actually they sometimes just need to stop taking it, and then they get told to stop taking it and they suddenly go back the other way and they swing wildly because they've not actually been given a task of tapering that dose. So dose to requirement. So I talked about a pyramid of health last year, and certainly there are certain things that you need to look at, which creates this baseline of health. And actually, you can clean these genes because, we've talked about various things that can dirty the genes, and, many of us will talk about the toxins within foods. We'll talk about the toxins within their environment. I'm going to go through these in a little bit more detail, but to clean up their diets, we've talked about how we can make that healthy, from a view of reducing some of the carbs in their diet, increasing some of the proteins, making them better quality, looking at all of these factors, just short of time, so that you can do, and I'll leave it there so you can take a picture at the end. I'm always conscious that you just keep wanting to work out where he's going to finish. And so all of those things that we think about cutting out, dairy and gluten and things like that, for people, you can transpose this to our pets, especially if they're on processed foods. Some of you are automatically doing that when you move them to raw. But there's also other things that we'll come across in how they're farmed as to whether there's other things within there, other pesticides, other toxins that are coming in that make a real difference. So do think about how you influence that. What are the next steps? Sleep. Oh, my dog sleeps all the time. He's a really lazy dog. He's sleeping. But actually, is it truly a deep sleep? Is that dog actually always on alert? Do you actually create an environment for them where they can truly relax? Or are they suddenly, as soon as somebody clicks the gate at the end of the drive, going nuts at the window? Okay? Or if there's constant buzz of the TV on pause because literally the electronics are still going, did you truly switch it off? So There are things, there's breath work in there. Actually doing some breath work yourself can influence your dog, so do think about that. You will have an effect on them. Movement, exercising, even for your puppies, giving them a relative amount of exercise, not stressing them with over-exercise. We've got what's going on with the stress in their lives, and that can really be an effect to consider. How can you reduce the stressors, because they will have an effect on how they transcribe some of those genes. So making sure that they're relaxed, that they have companionship, that they are being looked after, you're not constantly keeping them on high alert, can make a difference. And then lastly for me, I don't know why it's gone slightly wrong on that, is the hydration. Please keep up with appropriate hydration. That is not making sure there's enough water in the bowl. Hydration is far more than that. Structure the water, use some bone broths, use some collagen, use something else. Hydrate the cells. It's not, you notice I didn't put water on there, I put hydration. It's really important that you think about that. So, just to sum up, a little case. So this is a skin case that I had of Dexter, little Dachshund, that came to me. And actually, they'd been through 3 other vets, a nutritionist, and were still stuck in a horrendous chronic itch, yeast infection that had all of the various topicals applied. This dog was, literally overheating and itching at every 10 minutes that he was down the road. He'd stop and have a great scratch, and then wouldn't stop until they had actually picked him up, put him in his little carry basket, which is what he's snuggled up in there in the consult room. And we've done all of the things, and you notice that actually the NOS3, there is a relationship to how well they will actually utilize omega-3s within their system. He had exposure to some fish oils that we had to take out because of what was going wrong with the fish oils, the toxins that were in that. So you've got to be really careful. That was talked about again yesterday. And covered up for the big reveal, but you can actually already tell, because you couldn't tell because he was on his back, but actually there was virtually no hair on his back before. He'd lost most of his hair coat. And, that's his underneath. Now, it's not totally grown back, but he's certainly not got the big thickened yeast under his armpits. He's certainly not got, the bright red skin overheating. And that's not because I gave something specific. That's because we went through a whole clean protocol. Okay, so there's not that you have to necessarily be, I've got to treat this for the skin. But actually, just by making them think about what was going on in their environment, taking out the fact that the farmer at the bottom of the field kept spraying glyphosate 6 times through the growing season, suddenly made them realize why they were suffering health issues. Their parents that lived 3 doors up were suffering from health issues. So what's happening with these guys? They are moving house. They've now decided to decamp and go from just south of Birmingham up to the Highlands of Scotland and just decompress, because he can work from home, so he doesn't need, to be in that high-stress environment. And it has an effect on your children. Thankfully, these are not all mine, okay? But 2 of them are, but they literally are grown up now, so they won't mind me showing this photo, because you're not going to tell them. And so this is all of their, my nephews and nieces as well with them. And literally, you will find that you've got to think about this in the greater sphere of things, because it affects the next generation. And you can make some changes in what you're doing, not just to the pets and the pet parents, but actually all of their children. Okay, and that's a massive impact that you can make. So there are some extra references for the ones that I hadn't actually shown as a printout on there. if you want to take a picture quickly, and then literally a thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. I know that was a bit of a whirlwind through, and probably not in detail enough on some points, but there's only so much you can fit into 45 minutes.